When I spoke a couple of months ago, I left out part of my sermon. I didn't realize it until I got home and looked through my notes and realized I'd missed maybe one page of my sermon. And so just a few days later, I got an email from Ruth, and she asked me to speak on this Sunday in August. And I looked at the theme before I responded, and the theme was what I left out in the last sermon. So I haven't had to work as hard on this sermon. I just reviewed some of my notes. But the last few weeks, I read from the Daily Bread, get the devotional of the Daily Bread, as quite a few of you here do. And there have been 2 or 3 articles about generosity in the last few weeks. So I'd like to share a couple of those with you today. A few months ago, Keith Mullins spoke, and he talked about Mary wiping Jesus' feet, if you remember that. And Keith took a different angle, which I'd never heard before, was that Jesus generously received of Mary's gift. And sometimes we're not very good receivers of gifts. It's been said that it's better to give than receive, but he said Jesus always received. And in one of the articles in the Daily Bread from Jane Gardner just a few weeks ago, she said Jesus was good at accepting gifts from others: a drink of water, a fish, a cup of wine, a place to stay. It's been said that Jesus always received before he gave. And then she reminded us that Jesus was his ministry, his life and ministry, especially the last 3 years of his life and ministry. He was supported by the generosity of others. He never had a job as we have jobs. He was supported by the generosity of others. And he was a great receiver, a gracious receiver. So today we've come once again to remember Jesus and to generously receive of his generosity towards us. The parable that's most repeated in the gospel is a story of the Good Samaritan. The priest and the Levite, who was also a priest, walked by a man who had been beaten and robbed and left beside the road. When the Samaritan came by, he went out of his way to help the injured man and restore him to health. Samaritans were looked down upon by the Jews, but this Samaritan extended himself where other Jews didn't. He extended himself beyond the religious and cultural boundaries. An Apostle John A. Grover wrote a couple of weeks ago, "The borders we construct intentionally or unintentionally to protect a sense of us limit our capacity to fully live in God's kingdom. Even our faith and our worshiping communities are not immune to this limited capacity. If the church is an end to maintain self-serving programs and buildings, our mission is perpetuated by our usness." It's a word I'd never heard before, usness. Have you ever heard of that word? Usness, by our usness. She continued to write, "There's nothing wrong with finding comfort in a particularly gathered community. The parable of the Good Samaritan challenges us to live God's love and mission beyond us, beyond this usness, and beyond traditional forms of worship and traditional congregational life, and beyond buildings. We are called to be disciples, to go beyond ourselves in all ways. We are called to go beyond the borders which we create. It's not all about us. It's not all about me. We are called to go beyond that concept. In our culture, there's a lot of usness. We hear that all the time. It's not all about me is one of our favorite. It's not all about you is one of our favorite sayings, but it's not all about me either. I admit a lot of my time and a lot of my efforts are just perpetuating that usness. It's all about me. As we look in the up front, we've had these butterflies here all summer, and I have to admit that I live a lot of my life in a cocoon, not the butterfly. But if we get beyond ourselves, beyond the boundaries which we've created to protect ourselves, we can get beyond those boundaries, then we can become the butterflies, which I think are much more beautiful than the cocoons that we are in. I'd like to talk about a concept called spiritual reciprocity. Have you ever heard of that concept? Spiritual reciprocity. It's a concept about being generous to others. Jesus said, Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Well, we could paraphrase that by saying, Blessed are those who are generous with their attitudes towards others, for God will be generous with them. In the Lord's Prayer, Jesus said, Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who have trespassed against us. If we are generous towards others who have offended us, God will be generous towards us. He will reciprocate. Generosity is really an attitude of life, an attitude of gratitude. Just like Jesus, we've all benefited from others who have been so generous to us. And we all have stories to tell of generosity. I know when I first began attending the church on the south side of Columbus, I felt the people were very generous to me. And they greeted me, and what's the thing we like to hear the most? What's the thing that people like to hear the most? Their name. Their name. Remember, the most important thing you can do is greet somebody and know their name. Remember their name. We all like to hear their name. I was reading a book called The Master Greeter, and he said the number one thing, if you're going to be a greeter in a church, the number one thing to do is remember their name. People like to hear their name. It's hard. I can remember a phone number before I can remember a name for some reason. But it's difficult for me to do, but people like to hear their name. And I know the people at the South Congregation, when I attended there, greeted me by name and a smile and always said, It's nice to see you there. It's nice for you to be here. I think I attended about the same time, started attending about the same time that Sharon did. And I think we shared that experience of starting together, and people always greeted us by name. It was never my intention to go to church. I was always made to go to church Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and district conference. Anything, church doors were open, I was expected to be there. So it was never my intention to go to church, but I found the people to be so loving and accepting that I ended up being in church despite my intentions. But we all have wonderful stories of how people have been generous to us. I'd like to tell the story, and a few weeks ago, Vern Foster said remember he had us to get together and separate, and we told stories about our life to each other. He said it's important that we repeat the story, so I'd like to tell you, today is the 22nd anniversary of when we started attending this congregation here. It was the first 22 years ago today, or this week, was our first Sunday here at this building. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about the story of how that happened. We attended on Reinhardt and corner of Reinhardt and 22nd Street on the south side of Columbus, just east of German Village. And there was a German, and I think most of the people that attended were Germans. Joe's family was one that attended. Joe had an aunt named Ruth, and Joe's mother, I don't know how many, there were 3 or 4 children, 4 children at the time. And Ruth watched the building being built. Lived in the neighborhood, and I think they were probably German, right, Joe? The Wimlinger. It was the Wimlinger family. The kids watched the church being built, and they said, that's where we want to go to church. And Ruth used to tell a story that she was there the first day that the church opened. She was there and continued until she passed away here just a few years ago. But the family has spread all over the country now. I know some of the families in Worthington. Joe's brothers in Independence had quite a bit of family in Independence area. And in fact, Joe's niece, Jen Kilpack, you might have heard the name if you read any of the church publication. That's Joe's niece, Joe's brother's daughter. I didn't realize that till she came to Ruth's funeral. I didn't connect the two. But they're spread all over. Wimlinger family spread all over the country and all over the church. And so when we felt the church, it was one time we went outside after Sunday morning, and there was yellow tape around one of the apartment buildings next to the church. People felt unsafe attending that building, so we decided it was time that we look for a new place. So we took a survey, and this area was the one that people were most receptive to. The most people were receptive to this area. So we began looking for property in this area. And I remember I was going to the car auction. I was driving by this. I saw a little wooden sign about this big, says 5 acres for sale. So we contacted the people, and they wanted $40,000. It's hard to. It's probably worth $150,000, $160,000 an acre with frontage. Now it's worth like $40,000. We come up with the money and bought the property. A little bit later, another person called and said, I own 5 more acres adjacent to that property, and I don't want to build my house next to the church, so I'd like to sell my property too. So we bought 5 more acres, but we had to go through. We didn't have that much money, so we had to go through several fundraising efforts to do that. And we talked to the architect. We come up with $10,000 first and come up with an architect's plan. Well, he designed a church that would have been about $1.5 million to build. And so we spent all of our money on an architect's plan, which we never used because we couldn't afford it. And so we never lost faith. We continued to look around and try to come up with the money. And we ran into an architect by the name of Homer McKnight, and he just happened to be right off Stringtown Road in Grove City. He was the architect for the Grove City Nazarene Church. And some of us remember meeting with him. And they'd went through like 12 different building projects. Not up to that time, but they'd had like 12 different building projects. But he was their architect, and he told us, he said, I won't build a brick and mortar church anymore. He said, I used to design those. He's the largest designer of churches east of the Mississippi. And he said, I designed like family life centers, which they were in the process of designing their new facility at that time. So he took us over there, and he said, another thing we did, we went from using the hymns to contemporary music, and we meet in a lot of small groups now. And so we approached him about the additional 5 acres. He said, you'll never have another opportunity like this to purchase property, but we needed the money. We needed money for the church and that. So we had a fundraising effort. And I forget how much money we needed. I think it was $50,000 or $60,000 at the time. And so everyone filled out the pledges, and one person, it was Joe's Aunt Ruth, and we had 69 meetings to plan this facility. We had a total of 69 meetings. We had to sell the church, sell the house, find property, and get everything approved. We had a total of 69 meetings. And Ruth was so excited about it. I thought, well, if anyone wouldn't want to move, it would be Ruth, because she was at the first, she'd been attending this branch all of her life, but she was so excited about moving. So we took the pledges in, we got all the pledges, and it came out to be more than enough what we needed, so we decided to proceed. Well, we did. We made the decision to proceed and do what we could. Well, I didn't find out later. I told Ruth, I said, boy, your generous pledge, and I think her pledge was more than all the rest of them combined. I said, your generous pledge is allowing us to build the new church. She said, well, I'm coming into some money. And she said, I want to share it with the church. And so we went ahead with proceed. A couple months later, I was talking to I think Bonnie or Joe, Bonnie, and I said, boy, it's a good thing Ruth made that big pledge. I said, we wouldn't ever been able to start this. She said, well, Ruth doesn't have any money. I said, you're kidding. She said, no, she thinks she's going to get money from Publishing Clearinghouse. So here we were stuck. We thought we were stuck, but if she hasn't made that pledge, I don't think we ever would have been able to continue, but we did. So she made a commitment, without knowing it, she made a commitment that really got us over the hump. And it goes to show that God works through us in many ways. We have many weaknesses, and sometimes we dwell on those, but God can work through us, especially through our weaknesses. See, I've lost my notes, lost my place in the notes already here. So. But once we did, we met in a school in Grove City for 2.5 years. In the first year, we'd put our organ, we stored our organ in Bernie's basement, because our organist said, what are you going to do with the organ? I said, well, we'll just put it in the new church. And Bernie graciously allowed us to store the organ. We had a pipe organ. It would blast you out. at the old church. I mean, that organ would really, the pipe organ would really blast you out. So we didn't want to get rid of that, so we stored it in Bernie's basement, and among a few other things. And so let me catch up here with my notes, but stored that organ in Bernie's basement. We met in the school. In the first year, we had no music. No one could play a piano, and the worship services, at least I thought they were pretty bad. I mean, we just had no music at all. We didn't have a pianist. But I remember meeting with Bonnie and Katrina, I think, were the pastors, and I said, we got to do something about this. We had no pianists, but we had people that could play, several people who could play musical instruments. And David's not here today. David Lake could play the drums. We had Rich Galbraith. Oh, there's David. David Lake played the drums. Rich Galbraith had played contemporary music. He went to Graceland and played the guitar, and he was kind of the lead person, musical person. Craig Linfesty and Brenda sang. Craig could play the guitar. So several people, David's cousins played guitars, and so several people could play musical instruments. So we had quite a few people that could play musical instruments, so we started singing contemporary music and projecting it on the walls, which was really different for most people. That was the second year, and we did that for 19 months, and if you remember, we had to haul all the equipment in every Sunday morning. We'd meet at the school at 8 o'clock on Sunday morning, and David had I think it was a Chevy Blazer, right, David? Loaded that Chevy Blazer all the way up, met at 8 o'clock, carried all the equipment in, practiced. Once we got it set up, practiced till 9:30, and then after the service, took it down again. David took it home and repeated that process, I think, from January the 1st of one year till July the next year. It's like over a year and a half we did that. So it was a lot of generosity was shown there, especially by David, bringing that stuff back and forth. We practiced every Thursday night in somebody's home, but there was a lot of generosity shared in addition to the money being offered. And the people, especially some of the older people, I thought were very, very generous because they had to give up a lot. We gave up the organ. We gave up singing the hymns. We went to the contemporary music. We gave up the building with the stained glass in it. People gave up a lot, but they were very, very generous. And our mission was able to continue. Over the years, I've seen hundreds of people, literally hundreds of people come through our congregation who have been, when they came, they needed help in one way or another. Over the years, we've seen countless people, countless families come in and be blessed if they were open to receive, if they were gracious receivers. I've seen refugees, I've seen people in prison. A lot of people have been helped over the years, hundreds and hundreds. One person that we tried to help just passed away yesterday. If you remember, Keith Humphrey had just received the news last night, and I couldn't sleep last night. I just felt so bad for the family, for Bonnie and the family. But he had attended as a youth. He attended our congregation. He was 38 years old, and he was born. His mother was single in her teenage years when she had him, and I always felt like I think we all knew that he was born with two strikes against him, and kind of a dysfunctional family. And we tried to help. The people have been very, very generous over the years, trying to help Keith, and they've done many good things toward him. I think he knew that. But I think when he was 14 or 15, he was diagnosed as a type 1 diabetic. And that didn't help, and then he became addicted. And he lived lived 20 or so years with addiction. The last time I saw Keith was 3 or 4 years ago. He came to basketball, which he came quite a few times. I hadn't seen him for 3 or 4 years. But he came and had a Bible in his hand, and you can tell the Bible was used a lot. And there are a lot of verses, almost all the verses were underlined. And he said his goal was to get straight and become a camp counselor. And I hadn't heard or seen from him since. But you always want. I know that I probably never done as much for him. We used to pick him up and bring him to church. I've probably never done as much for a youth as I've done for Keith, and I know a lot of other people could say that too. So you feel guilty in some ways, but we did try to help him, but it just didn't work out the way that we thought. But I don't know what happened the last 3 or 4 years. I really don't. But the last time I saw him, he was on his way to recovery, and I'd like to remember him as being that person. Just last week we heard about Sarah Boyd. She'd been here like 3.5 years on her journey, and I watched her grow over the last 3 or 4 years, and I watched people give her support and help her, where she had the confidence to go to California to reach out in a new venture. But I've seen so many people come through this congregation that we've supported. Some have decided to remain, be a part of our faith community. Some have gone on to other places, decided to go on to other places. But I know that this church has been a blessing not only to me, but many people. And I've seen many people like Sarah come in and go on. We've had leaders in the church. We've had people that have attended here have went on to become apostles and other leaders throughout the district and the region and the world. So generosity takes many forms. As Amy mentioned, it's not all about giving money, although that is important. But sometimes this from Apostle Susan Oxley said, sometimes jumping in to supply a monetary need isn't the answer, but it's always appropriate to affirm someone's worth, their growth, and their discipline. It's always appropriate to affirm their worth, their growth, and their discipline. We haven't been successful with all the people that we've come in contact with. We've made many mistakes. I know I've made more mistakes than I have done things right with a lot of people. But our purpose continues, and God does work through our weaknesses. There's been a saying that if you build a better mousetrap, an old saying for old people remember, if you build a better mousetrap, the world will be the pathway to your door. That's the way I think it is with churches and with people. If we're able to listen to others, especially listen to other people, and love them, then the world will be a pathway to your door. And I'm not saying I'm a good listener. I have ways to go, a long way to go before I become a good listener. But I know I've noticed this with other people. We have many people in the congregation who are good listeners, and I know that the world has be a pathway to their door, and it will be to you too, as you do like I do, try to improve our listening ability. But it's important, I think, that we're willing to come out of our comfort zones, willing to come out of our comfort zones to be generous. And part of generosity is gratitude. Gratitude, as has been mentioned, is a great. It's something to pursue. Always being grateful for what we always, instead of thinking about what we don't have, think about what God has given us. And if we can do that, we can come out, we can reduce the boundaries, reduce the walls that we've created, reduce the boundaries that we've created in our lives in order to protect ourselves. So as we come to remember Jesus today, let us remember the generosity He shares with us today. He gave the greatest gift of all. He gave us the most generous gift of all. He gave His life for us.